Everything you ever wanted to know about the Accessibility Tree, presented by Russ Weekly, AliCamp 2021. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors Telstra and Intopia, our silver sponsors ANZ and Coles, and our bronze sponsor How2.
G'day, my name's Russ, and today we're going to be looking at everything you ever wanted to know about the Accessibility Tree. That's a pretty bold title, isn't it? So we're going to cover a range of things as part of this presentation. We're going to look at accessibility APIs, obviously the Accessibility Tree, and then we'll go into things like accessible names, descriptions, and how these names and descriptions are announced. We'll also look at a bit of ARIA and how it affects the Accessibility Tree. And finally, a bit of troubleshooting using the Accessibility Tree. Let's get into it. Oh, and one more thing before I start. As part of this session, I'm going to be doing some exercises on a dummy page, and you can actually play along with me if you want. The address is actually bit.ly, which is a short URL site, which is bit.ly/ and then AliCamp 2021, and that's ALLYCAMP 2021. Let's get into it. So let's start with accessibility APIs. And they're really important to understand because they have a big impact on the accessibility tree itself. So here we have a diagram, and there are four boxes sitting beside each other. From left to right, we have the DOM tree, the accessibility tree, the accessibility API, and the assistive technology. Now the first three boxes sit inside the browser, the DOM tree, the accessibility tree, and accessibility API. And outside of the browser is the assistive technology. And between each of these boxes, there are arrows going forwards and backwards. What we're really saying here is the DOM tree affects the accessibility tree, which we'll find out more about later, and the accessibility tree interacts with the accessibility API, and the accessibility API talks to assistive technologies. The accessibility API is the bridge between the accessibility tree and assistive technologies. So let's find out some more. Fundamentally, accessibility APIs communicate information about user interface from the browser to assistive technologies. Now, each browser operating system combination uses different types of accessibility APIs. On Windows, for Firefox, Chrome, and Opera, they support, are you ready for it, MSAA, iAccessible, and iAccessible2. Internet Explorer, always the black sheep in the family, supports MSAA, iAccessible, but UIA Express. On Mac, it's much easier. So OS X, you have Safari, Firefox, and Chrome all support NS accessibility. For mobile devices or iOS, Safari, Firefox, and Chrome support UI accessibility. So there you have it. I hope that didn't confuse the hell out of you, but that's a bit about accessibility APIs. So now we get to the meat of the sandwich. The accessibility tree. What the hell is it? Well, browsers use the DOM, along with some aspects of CSS, to generate this thing called the accessibility tree. As we saw in that diagram, first of all is a DOM, and that starts to generate the accessibility tree. The accessibility tree exposes information on specific elements to assistive technologies via this accessibility API, or each individual accessibility API in that browser. Now, the information that gets exposed is quite varied, and it includes things like the role, name, and state of all these objects in the accessibility tree, but also how each of these objects relates to other objects in the accessibility tree. And as we saw before, because of the accessibility APIs, each browser produces a unique accessibility tree, and that's because of the specifics of, their source code, accessibility API combinations, etc. Now, I'm hoping by the end of this session, you'll realize that the accessibility tree is extremely important in understanding how information is presented to assistive technologies. Now for this presentation, I'm going to be using Chrome's accessibility tree, but in reality, you could also use Firefox or even some of the other browsers. Let's now go and do an activity on how we could access the accessibility tree in Chrome. in order to access the accessibility tree, we need to inspect on an element. So we can go to any part of the page, right-click, and then just go Inspect Element. And that'll bring up our DOM tree at the left, and then some things at the right. And we have styles, computed layout, event listeners, etc. And we're going to move over to the drop-down and go to Accessibility. And what that's done is given us a view of different aspects of accessibility associated with this element. So why don't we now look at exactly what's in each of these? The first one will actually provide us with a tree, the actual accessibility tree. So in this case, we have information which is inside a link, in a paragraph, in the main, inside the root area. So it gives us the full tree leading down to that element. The second tab, or the second pane, tells us any ARIA attributes. And in this case, you'll see we have ARIA-label associated with this element. The third area is the most important area, and in fact, most of the session will be around this little area, which is computed properties. And that gives us information around the accessible name, which we'll talk about soon, as well as any roles and other states attached to it. And the fourth one is hard to use, but in some cases, it may provide a source order viewer for specific cases where we've changed the DOM in some way. So that's how you can use the Accessibility tab in Chrome. Now let's look at the accessibility tree in action. First of all, let's start by looking at the heading called What are mammals? And what we want to do is use the accessibility tree to determine its role and level. Inspect element. We move over here. You can see over in the DOM panel, we have the H1. And if we look over here and we go to computed properties, you can see it has a name of what are mammals. But what we really want to look at is it has a role of heading and a level of 1. So what that does is tell assistive technologies that when they hear this information announced, which is what are mammals, it's in an element which has a role of heading and a level 1. What about if we go over here to full name and look at the input, and if we inspect element and look here, what we want to do is to look at its role. So if we collapse some of these things here, it has a role of text box. Now it might be slightly different in some cases in different browsers and operating systems, etc., but fundamentally this is a text box. What about the email? So in this area we have an email with an input, and if we inspect element on there, what I want to do is to find out if semantically this is required, but also is its required nature explained or exposed in the accessibility tree. So inspect element, and we go to our input, and first of all, over at the left in the DOM, we can see there's a Boolean required attribute. So that's telling us semantically that this element is required. And if we look over here in the DOM, especially under the computed properties, you'll see down near the bottom, required true. Okay, back in that email field, what if we were to type something like AAA into that email field? What we really want to know is this information the current value of that element exposed in the accessibility tree? Again, inspect element, we right click on it, inspect, we go to the accessibility tree. You can see that email input is still exposed in the accessibility tree, but what we want to do is to see if it has a value attached to it. And if you look here, you can see the value is AAA. So as a user types in a field and then moves on to another field, the value becomes exposed in the accessibility tree. We can also see that in another element. So if we go down to, say, the favorite mammals and choose aardvark from the list of drop-downs, and if we inspect element, and go back here, and we make sure we click on the select element, you'll see that it has a value of aardvark. So values as well as accessible names are exposed in this accessibility tree, which gives us a lot of information to assistive technologies. What about something else? How about we look at subscribe to newsletter and click on the yes checkbox. So what we want to know now is that checked nature exposed in the accessibility tree? So inspect element using right click. We go down to the input and you'll see it has a role of checkbox. And more importantly, it has checked equals true. Now, if we look at the other checkbox, you'll see it has checked equals false because this one is the one that's currently checked and this one's not. So its checked nature is exposed to assistive technologies. Let's do another one. What about we click on the subscribe to newsletter just above that checkbox, and you'll see we have a legend and a field set. And what we want to know is the field set, 1, given a role, and 2, given an accessible name? So over here, you'll see the field set has a group, because fundamentally, field sets are used to group sections of forms together. And you'll see it has a name of subscribe to newsletter, and this is coming from the legend element. So it has a role and a name. Okay, let's go back here, and what we want to do is click around the heading up the top, inspect element again, but we're going to move slightly up the DOM to the main element. So that's the element that contains the main chunk of content on the page. And what we want to know is, does that one have an accessible name? So first of all, its role equals main. And again, we have a name attached to it. In this case, it says, what are mammals? But where's that coming from? Well, it's actually coming from the main is being labeled by the H1 element, which has text of what are mammals. So that H1 becomes the accessible name for that main element. And finally, let's go down to one of these tables, maybe the top one, and we'll look at land mammals. And if we inspect that element, we'll see we have table here. So the role equals table, and it has an accessible name of land mammals. And that's coming from the caption element, which says land mammals. So this caption is creating an accessible name for the table, and it also has a role of table. Now, this accessibility tab in Chrome gives us a wide range of properties that can be presented within this computed properties frame, and that depends on the element being inspected. But that can include things like the element's accessible name, its role, its description, the current value, whether the element is required, whether it is currently expanded, where it is currently checked, whether it's currently disabled. And then the last two, is it described by some other element, or is it labeled by some other element? So as you can see, a very rich set of information can be provided in Chrome's Accessible tab. Now let's look at accessible names. So accessible names are names given to elements within this accessibility tree. Accessible names are super important for assistive technologies because they help them identify the elements within the accessibility tree. Accessible names are defined as a text string, and Chrome's accessibility tree will show you all the possible options that can be used to provide the accessible name. So in this diagram here, we're looking at the names that are optionally provided. So we have, from the bottom, it could be done by the title, ARIA placeholder, the placeholder itself, the for attribute from the label, ARIA label, or even ARIA label by. And in this case, the label is providing the text full name, which then becomes the text string for the actual accessible name. Now, accessible names can be applied to elements in a wide range of ways, depending on the element itself. For example, the contents of links and buttons can be converted into text strings and used as their accessible names. Here we have two pieces of code, or two lines of code. We have the A element and the button element. So we have href, and inside the start and end tags, we have content. And then we have a button start and end tag, and inside content. So those two pieces of content become the accessible name for that element. It's not the only way, but that's the best way we can provide accessible names for those elements. The value of the alt attribute for images can also be converted into a text string and used as an accessible name for the image element. So here we have an image element in code. Source equals ball.jpg, alt equals content. That content becomes the accessible name for the image element. Now for elements that allow the title attribute, this title value can be converted into a text string, and that can become the accessible name for that element. So here we have a button. There's no text inside the button, so theoretically there's no accessible name. However, we have title equals content. So the value of that title, in this case content, could become the accessible name for that button. Similarly, for some elements, the placeholder value can be converted into a text string, and that can be used as the accessible name for that element. So here we have input type equals text, placeholder equals content. So in this particular case, if there's no label associated with that element, the placeholder could become the accessible name. Now this is not a good practice, it's just saying that it can be used. For some elements, the ARIA label value can also be converted into a text string, and that can become the accessible name. So again, we're back to a button element with a start and end tag, but in this case we have ARIA-label equals content. So that content becomes the accessible name, in this case at least, for this button element. But what about accessible names that can be used from another element? Well, the contents of the label element can be converted into a text string and used as the accessible name for things like inputs, selects, and text areas. And here we have an example with a label, which has a value of 4 equals name, and an input which has an ID of name. Now, because those two values match, the label is explicitly associated with the input, and therefore the label contents becomes the accessible name. So for this input, the accessible name would be content. In terms of the table, the contents of the caption element can be converted into a text string and used as an accessible name. So here we have a table. Inside there's a caption, start and end tag. The content inside the caption element would become the accessible name for the table. And then there's things like the ARIA label by attribute. Now the value of the ARIA label by attribute can also be converted into a text string, and that can be used as the accessible name for elements. So here we have a div with an ARIA labeled by equals heading, and inside there as a child we have an h2 with an ID of heading, and inside that there's contents. Now because the div is labeled by the h2's content becomes the accessible name for that parent div. Let's go and do an activity on accessible names in action. So let's look at the email field. We'll right click, inspect element, and in the accessibility tree you can see the input and the DOM, and over here you can see we have an accessible name of email. So where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from the label which has content of email. So that information there is creating an accessible name for our input. What about this link over here saying find out more? If we inspect that element and look at that in the accessibility tree, what's its accessible name? Well, you'd think it would be find out more, but you'll see that there's an ARIA label here which says find out more about mammals, and that has become the accessible name. The contents has been crossed out, and the ARIA label has become the accessible name. So that's suggesting that different names can be given to the element, but one of them has to win. Let's find out more about that. So a big question you might be asking at this point is, now that we've seen that little A element in action, which accessible name wins? Well, there's a set of rules around that. In the case of the A element and the button elements, as well as any element with a role of button or role of link, the rules are as follows. First of all, look for an ARIA label by attribute, and if that's the case, that becomes the accessible name. If not, use the ARIA label. If that's not there, use the element's content. Otherwise, use the title. And if none of those are present, then there's no accessible name. Now, obviously, the third option here is the best. In the case of both links and buttons, Ideally, we want to use the element's content for the accessible name, but it's actually only third highest in priority. What about the case of image elements? Well, the rules are quite similar in a way. First of all, just like before, if it's present, the ARIA labeled by will win. If that's not there, the ARIA label will win if it's present. If not, the alt attribute will win. Otherwise, the title will win. And if none of those are present, that element has no accessible name. And just like before, the alt attribute, or number 3 in this list, is actually the preferred method, but it's only third highest in priority. Now, what about things like input, selects, text areas, etc.? Well, for these, the rules are again quite similar with a couple of little extras. First of all, as before, the ARIA label by is used if present, otherwise the ARIA label. But here we have a different one. If it's present, then the label itself, or the contents of the label, would be used. Otherwise the title, or otherwise the placeholder. And if none of those provide an accessible name, then that element does not have an accessible name. Now, as before, the third option is our preferred here. For input, selects, and text areas, we really want to have a label that's explicitly associated, and the label content can become the accessible name. However, as before, it's actually only third highest in list of priority. Let's now have a look at accessible descriptions. So, an accessible description provides additional information on top of the accessible name that relates to the user interface thing, and it's designed to complement the accessible name. Now, this accessible description may or may not be presented visually on screen. And just like accessible names, accessible descriptions have to be defined as text strings. Let's now go into a quick exercise on accessible descriptions in action. Okay, let's look at the address element, and what we're going to do is inspect element on the input, right click, and there we have the input, and you'll see here we have a description which is include full street address. So most importantly, this has nothing to do with the accessible name. This is a totally different field in these property lists. But where's it coming from? Well, you can see down the bottom, it's being described by this other element. So the span above is creating a description for the input. And the reason is the input is being described by the element which matches that ID, which is this one here. So that is a quick example of an accessible description. Okay, now let's talk about how these accessible names and these accessible descriptions are announced in screen readers. So, how are they announced in different screen readers? Well, generally speaking, screen readers use announce objects from the accessible tree in the following way. The first thing they'll often announce is the accessible name for that object. Then they'll announce either the role of the object or a super short instructions around the object. Then they'll announce the accessible description, and then they might, depending on the browser, either announce a tiny bit more or a lot more instructions associated with that element. So what we're going to do is use that address input that we saw earlier on and see how that is announced in different screen readers. So on screen we have a diagram of the dummy page we've been looking at, just highlighting the address field. And if we look at the screenshot here of the accessibility tree, we'll see that the accessible name is address, the description is include full street address, and the role is text box. Now with VoiceOver, there's a pause after the accessible name and role are announced. So you'll see as we go through, there's a bit of a pause in the middle. So what you would get in say something like VoiceOver in Chrome is the accessible name of address, and then it would say the role of edit text. And remember how I said that it's either a role or a very short piece of information about how to use it. And then it'd be a pause, and then the description of include full street address, and then it would be additional information, which would be something like you are currently on a text field. To enter text in this field, type. So you would actually get address, edit text, pause, include additional address, you are currently on a text field. To enter this field, type. What about NVDA? Well, similar sort of process. Starts with the accessible name, address. The role or very short description in this case is just edit. And the description, as before, include full street address. The instructions are amazing. They just say blank. So for NVDA, address, edit, include full street address, blank. And what about JAWS? Well, the accessible name again is address, the role is edit, the description, as before, include full street address, and the additional instructions just say type in text. So for JAWS, it would be address, edit, include full street address, type in text. And there you have it. That's how the accessible names and descriptions are announced in various screen reader combinations. Okay, we're now going to talk about ARIA and how it interacts with the accessibility tree. And this is so important because ARIA is fundamentally about the accessibility tree. So you could sum up ARIA in 3 simple statements. And I have to say, when ARIA first came out, I wish someone had come to me and showed me these 3 statements because it simplifies ARIA down to its very core. Number 1, ARIA is just a series of custom HTML attributes. That is all it is. We're adding some attributes into the HTML markup, and these attributes do certain things. So ARIA is just a series of custom HTML attributes. And part number 2 is these attributes can be used to change and augment the accessibility tree. And part number 3, how do they augment the accessibility tree? Well, they can be used to add additional information that's useful for assistive technologies. Now you're probably asking, how? Well, ARIA can be used to change and augment the accessibility tree in the following ways. And the first one is it can be used to add or modify the semantics to the accessibility tree. Now, an example of that could be a button. So here we have a button element with no content inside, but you'll see that it has a role of tab. So in this case, we've changed the semantics. While it has a button element, and normally in the accessibility tree, it would have a role of button, because we've defined as role equals tab, in the accessibility tree, it would have a role of tab. The second thing that ARIA can do is apply states to the accessibility tree. So here's an example where we have a button again, and this one has aria-expanded equals true. So this is providing information in the accessibility tree to inform assistive technologies that this button is currently expanded. The third thing ARIA can do is provide or improve accessible names in the accessibility tree. So here we have a button again. We're really on buttons tonight or today. We have button, ARIA label equals closed modal. Now it could be, as in this case, there's no content inside the button, so it's got no accessible name. So by putting aria-label closed modal, we've actually given it a much better accessible name. Number 4, as we saw before, we can also provide descriptions to the accessibility tree. And in this case, we have an input, and below that we have an error message. And because they're linked together via the ARIA described by and IDs, this input now has an accessible description associated with it. Number 5, you can also use ARIA to establish relationships in the accessibility tree. So you could use this to inform assistive technologies of a relationship between specific elements that may not be possible to see directly within the DOM itself. And again, once again, we're using a button. This time it's got a role of tab again. But the important thing here is we want to establish a relationship between this tab, or button, which is a tab, and a tab panel below, which is just a div. So the button has a role of tab, the div has a role of tab panel, but they're connected. The button has aria-controls, and that's saying this element controls, and it's pointing to the same ID in the div with a role of tab panel. So we're actually establishing a relationship between the button and the div via the ARIA controls attribute. And number 6, informing assistive technologies about changes to the DOM. So that's what ARIA can do, and that's through this wonderful live regions, etc. So an example could be something like div with aria-live polite. We could also do something like active role equals alert. Both of these generate aspects of ARIA liveness, for want of a better word, and they inform assistive technologies that anything within this element, any changes to the DOM within that element could be announced depending on the ARIA Live options and things like ARIA Atomic, etc. But fundamentally, it's letting assistive technologies know, hey, something could change in this element, so be ready. Now, there's an important thing to discuss here, which is what ARIA does not do. And it's really important because a lot of people get confused. ARIA does not do any of the following. First of all, it doesn't modify the element's visual appearance. Remember, they are just HTML attributes inside the DOM. It does not modify the element's behavior. It does not add focusability to the element. And it does not add any keyboard functionality to the element. Once again, ARIA is just HTML attributes that can be used to add information to the accessibility tree to inform assistive technologies. Let's now look at troubleshooting via the accessibility tree. So we're going to look at some common ways that we can attack problems directly via the accessibility tree without even having to fire up a screen reader of any type. So, troubleshooting in action. Okay, let's look at some examples of troubleshooting. What we might start with is, let's go back up to the full name field. And what we're going to do is inspect element and go over here, and here's our input and here's our label. But one of the things we need to do as testers or people that are checking for accessibility is making sure that there is an accessible name there. Now, all it would take would be for us to change this full value or this ID value, and we could make this name disappear. So, for example, if we accidentally put the number 2 in this full value, then now these two elements aren't explicitly associated because these two values don't add up, they don't match. So if we now look at the input, and over here, right, we don't have an accessible name. So this is a quick way to be able to look at. On screen, it may look like there's a beautiful label there, but we can tell quickly whether there's an accessible name attached to it by seeing this information over at the right. If it's blank there, it means something's wrong. And then you can troubleshoot to find out what's wrong. And in this case, you go, oh, these don't match, and then you can make them match up. Another thing that might happen is that there is a missing for value entirely. So if we got rid of that completely, and a missing ID value. Now this is not uncommon. I'm sure you've all seen this for yourselves. So what we have now is a beautiful label and an input, but they are not explicitly associated at all. And if we look at the input, there's no accessible name. So in these cases, we just need to make sure that we put a matching for an ID value, and then suddenly the accessible name will take place. What about a field set? So we're going to go down to the subscribe to newsletter. We'll right click there, and we'll look at this field set and legend. Now, something that's not uncommon is that people put the wrong element here. So literally the other day, I saw someone put a label here. Oop. So they've got a label associated with the field set incorrectly. Inside the field set, the very first child should be a legend element. So you can test this by clicking on the field set and seeing if it has an accessible name. In this case, it's got a role of group, but no accessible name. And that means that someone's failed to deliver the proper element there. And that can be fixed using a legend. And then you will become a legend. My God, that was a dad joke. Okay, so there we have a name of subscribe to newsletter. Okay, what about something like the address? What if we want to know whether the instructions are actually being explicitly associated and therefore announced with this element? What we can do is click on the input, right click and go inspect element again. And here we have the input, and as we saw before, the help text is actually nicely associated with that element. And we can see this because the description is being displayed here. But what if it wasn't? An example might be, just as we did before, the values don't match up. And now if we click here, you can see while there's an accessible name, there's no description at all. And this could be either because the values don't match up, or more importantly, They just haven't used an ID and they haven't used an ARIA described by. And then you'll get an element which does not have a description. So all it takes, if we reload, is to make sure that the span has an ID and the input has a matching ARIA described by. This element is being described by that element, and then we have our description. And the last one is very similar, but on the phone you'll see there's an error message, and we can do exactly the same again. Inspect element, right click over here. Now in this case, we're actually going to see two pieces of information. So this input has help text and an error message. So where is it getting it from? Well, right down the bottom here, it has two descriptions. So the first one is coming from the help text, so include street area code, and the second one's coming from the error message, and that is error must include all 8 digits. Now you can string two values together, and this is what happens here. We have form phone help, and we have form phone error. Now in here you'll see they're space separated, and that means they're put out in that order. So it's going to go include area code, and then error must include all 8 digits. And you can see that all here. Include area code, error must include blah, blah, blah. A quick way to tell whether not only help information, but error messages are actually programmatically or explicitly associated with the correct inputs. So that's it, we're finished. Hopefully that was valuable. Hope you all have a wonderful day.
AliCamp 2021